Our neighborhood has always been considered one of the most peaceful in the city. Tree-lined streets, well-kept houses, and friendly neighbors who greeted each other with smiles as they passed by. It was the kind of place where children could play freely on the sidewalks, and residents left their doors unlocked without fear. At least, that's how it used to be. My name is Tyler, and I've lived here with my parents and my younger sister Haley for as long as I can remember. Our house is right across from Mr. Miller's, a civil engineer who has always been kind and helpful. He used to assist my father with small repairs, and even taught me some math tricks when I was in high school. Everything started to change on an autumn night. I was coming home late from a friend's party when I noticed something strange. The lights in Mr. Miller's house were flickering wildly, as if someone were turning the switches on and off repeatedly. I thought about going to check, but something held me back. A chill ran down my spine when I heard a muffled scream coming from there. It wasn't a scream of pain or fear, but something different. Something that made my stomach churn. I ran inside and locked the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just my overactive imagination, fueled by the horror movies I loved so much. But I couldn't sleep that night, watching from my bedroom window as the lights continued to flicker in the house across the street. The next morning, everything seemed normal. Mr. Miller left for work as usual, politely waving to my mom, who was watering the plants in the garden. But there was something different in his eyes, a strange glimmer that didn't match his forced smile. The following days brought a series of unsettling events. Objects began to disappear from our yard, tools, Haley's toys, even the welcome mat from our front door. My parents blamed teenage vandals, but I had a dark feeling. One night, I woke up startled by the sound of something scratching at my window. I opened my eyes and nearly screamed when I saw a face pressed against the glass, wide eyes staring at me in the darkness. It was Mr. Miller, his face twisted in an expression that mixed desperation and fury. He vanished before I could react, leaving only dirty fingerprints on the glass. I tried to tell my parents, but they didn't believe me. "Mr. Miller is a respectable man," they said. "You must have had a nightmare." But I knew what I had seen, and fear began to root deeply within me. Things quickly worsened. I started to notice Mr. Miller watching me whenever I left the house. He was always there, standing on his porch or peeking through the curtains. His behavior became increasingly erratic. Once I saw him in the middle of the street at 3 a.m, shouting at the sky in a language I didn't recognize. The turning point came when Haley disappeared for a few hours. We found her hiding in our basement, trembling and murmuring about the bad man who had tried to take her. My parents finally began to suspect that something was wrong, but still hesitated to openly accuse our neighbor. I knew I had to do something. I started investigating, watching Mr. Miller's house day and night. That's when I noticed the strange patterns. He left at irregular hours, always carrying large black bags. The smell coming from his house was nauseating, a mix of decay and chemicals. One night, I gathered the courage to sneak into his yard. What I saw through the basement window haunts me to this day. Shelves filled with jars containing things I can't describe. Photos of people, including my family, pinned to the walls, their faces marked with red lines. And in the center of it all, a table covered in scribbled papers with strange symbols and complex calculations. I ran back home, my heart threatening to leap out of my throat. I knew we had to get out of there, and fast. But when I got home, I found the front door wide open. The inside was a mess, furniture overturned, glass shattered. And in the middle of the living room, my parents and Haley were sitting on the floor, tied up and gagged, with Mr. Miller standing behind them, holding a gun. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, I saw the complete madness that had taken hold of him. "Ah, Tyler," he said in a strangely calm voice. "I was waiting for you. We have a lot of work to do." My blood ran cold in my veins at the sight of my family held hostage by the man we once considered a friend. Mr. Miller smiled, but it wasn't the kind smile I knew. It was a grotesque grimace that distorted his features, turning him into something almost inhuman. "Come, Tyler, join us," he said, gesturing with the gun. "We have much to discuss about the future of our neighborhood." I stepped inside slowly, my eyes flickering between the terrified faces of my family and the gun in Mr. Miller's trembling hand. The smell of alcohol wafted from him, mixed with something else, something chemical and nauseating. "You know, Tyler," he began, his voice oscillating between a confidential tone and sudden shouts. "I always knew you were special. You saw things that others didn't see, didn't you? You knew something was wrong." He began pacing back and forth, gesturing wildly with the gun. "They are everywhere, Tyler, infiltrated among us, parasites. But I've figured out how to stop them. I have the formula." My mind raced, trying to find a way out. I needed to keep him talking, buy time. "What formula, Mr. Miller?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. His eyes sparkled with a sick enthusiasm. "The formula to purify our community, to eradicate the infestation." He stepped closer, his hot, fetid breath in my face. "But they tried to stop me. My boss, my colleagues, they're all part of the conspiracy. They called me crazy, took my job, my license, but I showed them. Oh yes, I showed them." A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the black bags he carried, the smell coming from his house. What exactly had he shown them? Suddenly a noise from the kitchen made him turn abruptly. It was our chance. I lunged at him, trying to grab the gun. We struggled fiercely, rolling on the floor among shards of glass and broken furniture. The gun fired, the bullet passing so close to my head that I felt the rush of air. I managed to break free and ran to the kitchen, Mr. Miller on my heels. I grabbed the first thing I saw, a heavy pot, and turned just in time to hit him as he entered the room. He stumbled, dazed, but didn't fall. "You don't understand, Tyler," he shouted, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "They're going to get all of us if we don't act now." I seized his momentary disorientation to run back to the living room. I started to frantically untie my parents and Haley, my fingers trembling so much I could barely undo the knots. Mr. Miller appeared in the doorway, the gun pointed at us. "Don't move," he yelled, but there was hesitation in his eyes. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the man he used to be, battling the madness that consumed him. That moment of hesitation was all we needed. My father, partially free from his bindings, lunged at him. The gun fired again, the bullet lodging in the ceiling. They struggled, my father using all his strength to keep Mr. Miller on the ground. "Run!" my father shouted. I picked up Haley, and, along with my mother, we ran out of the house. The sound of the struggle continued inside, punctuated by screams and the sound of things breaking. We reached the street, breathless and panicked. The lights were beginning to turn on in the neighboring houses, alerted by the gunshots and screams. Someone shouted that they had called the police. The next few minutes seemed to drag on for hours. We stood there, trembling on the sidewalk, staring fixedly at our house, fearing the worst. When we finally heard the sirens approaching, I felt a momentary relief. But then, the front door burst open violently. Mr. Miller emerged, dragging my father as a human shield, the gun pressed against his temple. "Stay where you are," he shouted at the neighbors who were beginning to gather. "Nobody comes closer or I'll shoot." His eyes found mine again, and what I saw in them froze me to the core. There was no longer a trace of sanity there, only a terrifying void. "You'll understand one day, Tyler," he said, his voice oddly calm amid the chaos. "You'll see that I was right all along." The police cars arrived, surrounding the area. Officers got out, guns drawn, yelling orders at Mr. Miller. But he seemed not to hear them, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as if he were seeing something no one else could. "They're coming," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the clamoring of the sirens and screams. "They're here." Everything happened in an instant. Mr. Miller pushed my father forward and raised the gun. Several shots echoed through the night. I saw Mr. Miller's body fall in slow motion, a red hole blooming in his chest. As paramedics rushed to attend to him, and the police surrounded the area, I stood there, paralyzed. The neighborhood I knew and loved had turned into a nightmare in a matter of days. And even with Mr. Miller down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger and much darker. I looked at my family, at the shocked faces of my neighbors, at the house that had always been my refuge and now seemed a place of horror. And I wondered, what exactly had Mr. Miller discovered? And was there, after all, any truth in his madness? The weeks that followed the incident with Mr. Miller were a blur of police interrogations, persistent reporters, and sleepless nights. My family desperately tried to return to normalcy, but I knew nothing would be the same. Mr. Miller survived the gunshots but was admitted to a maximum security psychiatric facility. Investigations revealed unimaginable horrors in his home. Bodies were found buried in the basement, some in advanced states of decomposition, others altered in ways the police reports refused to detail. But the worst was in the notebooks. Dozens of them, filled with complex equations, bizarre diagrams, and frantic notes about interdimensional portals and cosmic parasites. The police dismissed it all as the ravings of a madman, but I couldn't stop thinking about the things Mr. Miller had said that fateful night. I began to notice strange things happening in the neighborhood. Unexplained lights in the night sky, sounds that seemed to come from nowhere, pets mysteriously disappearing. I tried to talk to my parents about it, but they insisted it was just my mind playing tricks, traumatized by recent events. One night, about a month after the incident, I woke up to a noise coming from the yard. I looked out the window, and my heart almost stopped. There was a figure standing in the middle of the lawn, staring directly at my window. For a terrifying moment, I thought it was Mr. Miller, somehow escaped from the hospital. But when the moon came out from behind the clouds, I saw it was not human. The creature was tall and thin, with limbs too long and joints bending at impossible angles. Its skin seemed to pulse and move, as if something was writhing beneath it, and its face, God, its face was just a smooth expanse of flesh, with no eyes, nose, or mouth. I shut my eyes tight, praying it was just a nightmare. When I opened them again, the creature had vanished. But the next morning I found strange marks on the lawn, as if something with sharp claws had walked through. I began obsessively researching, diving into conspiracy theories and reports of UFO sightings. The more I read, the more connections I made with Mr. Miller's notes, and the more frightened I became. I tried to alert the authorities, but I was ignored. Another nut job like Miller, I heard a cop murmur when he thought I wasn't listening. I realized I was alone in this. Things quickly got worse. Neighbors began to act strangely, as if they were slightly wrong versions of themselves. Their movements were rigid, mechanical, and their smiles never reached their eyes. On one occasion, I saw Mrs. Johnson, our elderly neighbor, devouring a raw bird in her yard. When she saw me, she just smiled, blood dripping down her chin. I tried to convince my family to move, but they refused to believe me. "It's just your imagination, Tyler," my mom would say, her eyes strangely vacant. "Everything is perfectly normal." But I knew it wasn't. The sky looked wrong, with colors that shouldn't exist flickering on the horizon. The air had a strange, metallic, sweet smell, and at night I could hear things moving outside, things too large to be known animals. I decided to visit Mr. Miller at the psychiatric hospital. I needed answers, no matter how terrifying they were. When I arrived, I found the place in chaos. Mr. Miller had escaped the night before, leaving behind a cell covered in strange symbols drawn with his own blood. I rushed home in a panic, only to find chaos. Police cars and ambulances filled the street. My house was surrounded by yellow tape. I ran, shouting for my family, only to be stopped by an officer. "You don't want to see this, kid," he said, his face pale and sweaty. "It's not natural." But I saw. Through a gap between the officers, I saw the bodies, my parents and Haley, or what was left of them. They were opened, as if something had come out of them. And around the bodies, more of those strange symbols, identical to those in Mr. Miller's cell. I fell to my knees, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. It was then that I heard the voice. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. "Tyler." I looked up, and there he was. Mr. Miller, standing across the street. But there was something different about him now. His eyes glowed with a strange light, and his skin seemed to ripple like that of the creature I had seen in the backyard. "It's time, Tyler," he said, his voice sounding like several voices speaking at once. "They are coming, and you are the key." Before I could react, the sky opened up, not like a storm, but literally opened, revealing a pulsing void beyond. Creatures impossible to describe began to descend, their bodies distorting the reality around them. The people around me began to scream, some falling to their knees, others running in panic. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, staring at Mr. Miller as he extended a hand in my direction. "Come, Tyler," he said, smiling. "Let's welcome our new masters." And the worst part? A part of me wanted to go. A part of me now understood what Mr. Miller had discovered, what he had tried to warn us about. The world as we knew it was ending, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. As chaos spread around me and the sky continued to open, revealing horrors beyond human comprehension, I found myself taking a step toward Mr. Miller, and another, and another. The end was coming, and I was walking straight toward it. The acrid smell of cigarette smoke invaded Sarah's nostrils as she leaned over the apartment window, observing the silent night enveloping the Oakwood Heights residential complex. Her hand instinctively caressed her 6-month belly, feeling the slight movement of the baby inside her. The clock on the wall read 2:37 a.m., but sleep evaded her like a reluctant lover. It was then that she saw him for the first time. A lanky, disheveled figure emerged from the shadows between the buildings, moving erratically under the yellowed glow of the streetlights. Sarah squinted, trying to discern the details of the man who seemed to be dancing a macabre waltz with invisible demons. "Jack," she whispered, nudging her sleeping husband. "There's someone out there." Jack grumbled and turned over in bed, ignoring Sarah's call. She turned her attention back to the window, a shiver running down her spine as she watched the stranger stop abruptly and look directly up, as if he could feel her gaze upon him. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes met across the darkness. The man's face was obscured by shadows, but Sarah could swear she saw a smile forming on his lips, a smile that didn't reach his empty, bloodshot eyes. In the days that followed, the presence of the stranger became a sinister constant in the couple's nights. Sarah watched him wander through the complex, sometimes shouting at the sky, other times huddling in dark corners as if fleeing from some invisible torment. "He must be on drugs," Jack tried to rationalize one night, cradling Sarah, who was trembling after yet another visual encounter with the intruder. "I'll talk to the management tomorrow." But the complaints fell on deaf ears. The man wasn't officially a resident, they said, and there was no evidence he was committing any crime. The police were called a few times, but by the time they arrived, he had already vanished into the shadows like an urban specter. Sarah's obsession with the stranger grew with each passing night. She began to notice patterns in his movements, how he always stopped in front of their building for exactly 7 minutes before continuing his nocturnal pilgrimage. And there was something else, something that made her blood run cold. He seemed to be watching her too. One afternoon, while Sarah was returning from shopping, she saw him in broad daylight for the first time. He was sitting on a bench near the entrance of the complex, his thin, pale body grotesquely contrasting with the brightness of the sunny day. As she passed, he lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers with a disturbing intensity. "Hello, Mommy," he said, his voice hoarse and cracked like shattered glass. "Your baby is growing strong?" Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. How did he know? She quickened her pace, her fingers gripping the shopping bag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Behind her, she could hear the man's laughter, a sound that seemed more like an animal growl than anything human. That night, Sarah woke up startled, cold sweat trickling down her back. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. She could feel a presence in the room, an oppressive weight that seemed to suck all the air away. Slowly turning, her heart nearly stopped when she saw a silhouette outlined against the window. The man was there, inside the room, his face a mask of shadows and white teeth gleaming in the darkness. Sarah opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. She was paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. "Shh," the intruder said, bringing a finger to his lips in a grotesquely gentle gesture. "We don't want to wake Daddy, do we?" Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, praying that when she opened them again, it would all be just a terrible dream. But when her eyelids opened, he was still there, now beside the bed, his bony hand reaching toward her pregnant belly. "Can I feel?" he asked, his voice a rough whisper scraping against Sarah's ears. "I just want to say hello to the little miracle." It was then that Sarah found her voice and screamed. Sarah's scream pierced the night like a sharp blade, jolting Jack from his deep sleep. He sat up with a start, eyes wide, searching for danger in the darkened room. The figure of the intruder was a misshapen shadow against the faint light coming through the window, his hand still extended toward Sarah's belly. "Get away from her," Jack roared, launching himself from the bed toward the stranger. But the man was fast, inhumanly fast. With a fluid motion, he dodged Jack's attack and leaped through the open window, disappearing into the night as if he had never existed. Jack's heart raced as he ran to embrace Sarah, who was sobbing uncontrollably. "He was here, Jack," she whimpered through tears. "He wanted to touch the baby." Jack's hands trembled as he dialed 911. The police arrived within minutes, but there was no sign of the intruder. Searches of the complex and surrounding areas revealed nothing but shadows and empty alleys. Officer Johnson, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, tried to comfort the couple. "We'll increase patrols in the area," he promised, his deep voice laced with concern. But without concrete evidence or witnesses. The officer's words were interrupted by a high-pitched scream coming from the neighboring apartment. Jack and Sarah exchanged fearful glances as the officers ran to investigate. Minutes later, they returned, their faces pale and tense. "Mrs. Matthews," Officer Johnson explained, his voice trembling slightly. "She says she woke up and found a man standing at the foot of her bed watching her. When she screamed, he fled through the window." A heavy silence fell over the apartment, broken only by Sarah's muffled sobs. The terror that had once seemed confined to their small world was now spreading like a dark stain, engulfing the entire Oakwood Heights complex. In the weeks that followed, fear became a permanent resident of Oakwood Heights. Windows were locked, curtains remained drawn, and the sound of footsteps in the hallway was enough to make hearts race. Sarah began sleeping with a knife under her pillow, her dreams haunted by moving shadows and eyes that glowed in the darkness. It was on a particularly cold October night that the situation reached its terrible climax. Sarah was alone in the apartment, Jack having been forced to work overtime. The clock read 11:47 p.m. when she heard it, a soft scratching, almost imperceptible, coming from the front door. Her entire body froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing in alert. The sound stopped for a moment, only to start again with more intensity. Sarah could visualize long, bony fingers sliding over the wood, searching for a crack, an opening. With her heart in her throat, she grabbed the phone and dialed Jack, her fingers trembling so much that she almost dropped the device. "He's here," she whispered as soon as she heard her husband's voice. "At the door. Oh God, Jack, he's trying to get in." "Lock yourself in the bedroom now," Jack shouted, the panic evident in his voice. "I'm calling the police. Don't open the door for anyone but them, got it?" Sarah barely had time to murmur an agreement before she heard a deafening crash, the front door being forced open. She ran to the bedroom, locking the door behind her and curling into the farthest corner, one protective hand over her belly. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, echoing through the silent apartment like the tolling of a funeral bell. Sarah could hear the intruder's heavy breathing, punctuated by low, maniacal giggles that made her blood run cold. "Mommy?" the hoarse voice called, terrifyingly close. "Where are you hiding, Mommy? The baby wants to play." Tears streamed silently down Sarah's face as she listened to the man rummaging through the apartment, knocking over furniture and breaking objects in his frantic search. The doorknob of the bedroom shook violently, and Sarah stifled a scream. "I found you," the intruder sang, his voice a grotesque mixture of childish joy and adult malice. "Come on, Mommy, open the door. Don't you want me to meet the baby?" The sound of sirens in the distance was like music to Sarah's ears, but her relief was short-lived. With a roar of rage, the man began to pound on the door with renewed force. The wood groaned and creaked under the furious assault. "No!" he howled between blows. "He's mine, my baby. You can't take him away from me." The door gave way with a deafening crack, just as the red and blue lights flooded the room through the window. Sarah saw the intruder's face clearly for the first time. Bloodshot eyes, dilated pupils, mouth twisted into a maniacal grin. He lunged toward her, hands outstretched like claws. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Officers stormed into the room, subduing the shouting man who thrashed like a wild animal. Sarah watched, stunned, as he was dragged out, still screaming about his baby. The weeks that followed the incident were a blur of police statements, therapy visits, and sleepless nights. Sarah and Jack discovered that the intruder's name was Evan Blackwood, a man with a history of mental health issues and substance abuse. He had been institutionalized several times, but always managed to escape or be released early due to overcrowding. The police found a journal in his makeshift hiding spot in the back of the Oakwood Heights complex. The pages were filled with incoherent scrawls and disturbing drawings of deformed babies. Amid the chaos, one phrase was obsessively repeated: "My son will come back to me." Further investigations revealed a tragic story. Evan had lost his wife and unborn child in a car accident 5 years prior. Since then, his sanity had rapidly deteriorated, leading him into a spiral of drugs and delusions. He was convinced that his child had not died, but had instead migrated to another woman's womb. Sarah couldn't help but feel a confusing mix of pity and revulsion when thinking about Evan. The terror he had inflicted on her and Jack was undeniable, but knowing what had driven him to that point made the situation seem even more tragic. With Evan imprisoned and awaiting trial, the couple tried to resume their normal life, but the shadow of the incident hung over them like a dark cloud, poisoning even their happiest moments. One night, about a month after the incident, Sarah woke up with a start. The room was dark and silent, but she could swear she had heard something, a whisper, perhaps, or the sound of light footsteps. Her heart raced instantly, the familiar fear tightening in her throat. "Jack?" she called softly, poking her sleeping husband. There was no response. Sarah stretched out her hand to turn on the bedside lamp, but her fingers found only emptiness. Confused, she fumbled in the dark, searching for the familiar nightstand. Nothing. Panic began to settle in her chest as she realized she could not feel Jack's presence beside her. A strong chemical smell invaded her nostrils, making her head spin. She tried to get up, but her body felt too heavy, her movements slow as if she were submerged in molasses. "Jack!" she screamed, or at least tried to. Her voice came out as a muffled whimper. Suddenly, a blinding light flooded the room. Sarah blinked, her eyes watering as they tried to adjust. When she finally managed to focus, her blood ran cold in her veins. She was not in her bedroom. The sterile white walls, the smell of antiseptic, the distant sound of machines beeping. It was a hospital, but not a normal hospital. The windows were barred, and the door was locked from the outside. "Welcome back, Sarah," a familiar voice said softly. Turning her head with difficulty, she saw Evan Blackwood sitting in a chair beside the bed, wearing a white doctor's coat. His face, once twisted by madness, now displayed a disturbing calm. What is happening?" Sarah stammered, her tongue feeling too big for her mouth. Evan smiled, a sad, knowing smile that made Sarah's stomach churn. "You had another episode, dear, but don't worry, we're taking care of you." "Episode? No, this isn't real. Where is Jack? Where is my baby?" Evan's smile faltered for a moment, a shadow passing over his eyes. "Oh, Sarah," he sighed. "We've talked about this. Jack isn't real. The baby has been gone for a long time." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. She looked down, expecting to see her 6-month pregnant belly. Instead, she found only the flat plane of her abdomen beneath the hospital gown. "No," she whispered, tears beginning to stream down her face. "No, this isn't real. You're lying." Evan stood up, grabbing a clipboard hanging at the edge of the bed. "Sarah Blackwood, hospitalized for 5 years after a psychotic collapse triggered by the loss of her husband and unborn child in a car accident," he read aloud. "She presents with recurring delusions in which she believes she is pregnant and is being pursued by a man trying to steal her baby." Sarah shook her head frantically, trying to block out the words. This couldn't be true. She remembered everything. The apartment, the nights of terror, Jack's face. But as she struggled against the restraints holding her to the bed, flashes of another reality began to invade her mind. The accident, the funeral, the foggy months that followed, and Evan. Evan always by her side, not as a stalker, but as a devoted husband, desperate to help her overcome the trauma. "No," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "Please don't be real." Evan leaned in, gently caressing Sarah's face. His touch was familiar, comforting in a way that made her want to scream. "It's okay, my love," he murmured. "I'm here. I will always be here." As Sarah's consciousness wavered, cradled by the medication in her bloodstream, she found herself trapped between two realities. In one, she was a terrified victim, struggling to protect her family from a deranged intruder. In the other, she was the disturbed patient, lost in a maze of grief and denial. And somewhere, deep within her fractured mind, a baby that never was cried endlessly, echoing in the empty halls of a life that could have been. The crackle of autumn leaves beneath my feet did little to mask the rapid pounding of my heart as I walked down Maple Street. Even now, years later, I can't help but shudder when I recall the events that unfolded in that seemingly ordinary suburban neighborhood. My name is Jack, and I was just 12 years old when I first encountered the terror that lived next door. Mrs. Abernathy's house stood out like a festering wound on our picturesque block. While other homes boasted well-manicured lawns and cheerful flower beds, hers was a decrepit fortress of peeling paint and overgrown weeds. The windows, perpetually shuttered and draped, seemed to glare at passers-by with malevolent intent. I remember the day I first caught a glimpse of her. It was a crisp October afternoon, and I was riding my bike home from school. As I pedaled past her property, a curtain twitched ever so slightly. For a split second, I locked eyes with the most haunting visage I'd ever encountered. Her face was a road map of deep wrinkles, her skin sallow and stretched taut over protruding cheekbones. But it was her eyes that froze the blood in my veins, two black, bottomless pits that seemed to bore into my very soul. From that moment on, an inexplicable dread took root in the pit of my stomach. I began taking alternate routes home, anything to avoid passing by Mrs. Abernathy's lair. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in hues of purple and orange, I found myself forced to walk past her house. My bike had a flat tire, and I was running late for dinner. As I approached, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The air grew thick and oppressive, as if the very atmosphere around her property was tainted. Suddenly, the front door of Mrs. Abernathy's house creaked open. I froze mid-step, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. There she stood, a silhouette backlit by a sickly yellow glow from within. In her gnarled hand, she clutched something that glinted in the fading light. A butcher's knife, its blade wickedly sharp. "You there, boy," she shrieked, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "Come here. I need your help with something." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt leaden. Mrs. Abernathy took a halting step forward, then another. The knife in her hand swayed menacingly. "Don't be shy, child," she cooed, her tone a grotesque parody of sweetness. "I've got cookies inside. Don't you want a treat?" As she shuffled closer, I caught a whiff of something putrid, a mix of decay and something metallic that made my stomach churn. Her yellowed teeth gleamed in a feral grin, and I saw dark stains on the front of her tattered housecoat. Finally, adrenaline surged through my veins. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the pavement, as Mrs. Abernathy's maniacal laughter echoed behind me. I didn't stop until I reached my front porch, gasping for air and fighting back tears of terror. That night, huddled under my blankets, I tried to convince myself it was all a bad dream, but the sound of sirens in the distance and hushed, urgent conversations between my parents told me otherwise. Something sinister lurked next door, and I had a sickening feeling that this was only the beginning of my nightmare. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner of my eye sent my heart racing. My parents, noticing my distress, tried to reassure me. "Mrs. Abernathy is just a lonely old woman," they'd say. "She doesn't mean any harm." But they hadn't seen the murderous glint in her eyes, hadn't felt the malevolence that radiated from her like a toxic miasma. I began to notice strange occurrences in our neighborhood. Pets went missing, only to be found days later in gruesome states of dismemberment. Gardens withered overnight, the plants twisted and blackened as if poisoned, and always, there was Mrs. Abernathy, watching from behind her grimy windows. One night I woke to the sound of scratching at my bedroom window. Petrified, I lay motionless, scarcely daring to breathe. The scratching grew more insistent, accompanied by a low, guttural growling. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept to the window and peeked through a gap in the curtains. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. Mrs. Abernathy stood on our lawn, her nightgown billowing in the breeze. But it wasn't her presence that chilled me to the bone. It was what surrounded her. Shadowy figures, vaguely humanoid but wrong somehow, writhed and danced around her. Their elongated limbs twisted at impossible angles, and where their faces should have been, there were only swirling voids of darkness. Mrs. Abernathy raised her arms and the creatures responded, surging towards our house. I stumbled back from the window, a scream lodged in my throat. The scratching intensified, now coming from all around, the walls, the ceiling, under the floorboards. I huddled in the corner of my room, paralyzed with fear, as the sounds of splintering wood and shattering glass filled the air. Just as I was certain death was imminent, a brilliant light flooded my room. The unholy cacophony ceased abruptly, replaced by an unearthly shriek that seemed to come from Mrs. Abernathy herself. I dared to look out the window once more. The old woman stood alone on our lawn, her face contorted in rage as she glared at something in the sky, a pulsing orb of white light that hovered just above the rooftops. The light grew brighter, and Mrs. Abernathy's form began to waver, like a mirage in the desert. She let out one final bone-chilling wail before seeming to implode, collapsing in on herself until nothing remained but a wisp of black smoke that quickly dissipated in the night air. The next morning, I awoke convinced it had all been a terrible nightmare. But the claw marks on my window and the lingering smell of sulfur in the air told a different story. My parents, however, remembered nothing of the night's events. When I tried to explain what had happened, they exchanged worried glances and scheduled an appointment with a child psychologist. Life seemed to return to normal in the weeks that followed. Mrs. Abernathy's house stood empty, a for sale sign swaying in the front yard. The neighbors whispered that she had been taken to a nursing home, or perhaps had passed away in her sleep. But I knew the truth, even if no one believed me. It wasn't until a month later that my worst fears were realized. I was walking home from school when I saw a moving truck parked in front of Mrs. Abernathy's old house. A family was moving in, a couple with a young daughter about my age. As I watched them unload their belongings, the little girl turned and waved at me, a friendly smile on her face. But then she blinked, and for a split second, her eyes were not the eyes of a child. They were black, bottomless pits that I recognized all too well. The girl, or whatever inhabited her form, grinned at me, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. I ran home, my heart pounding, knowing that the nightmare was far from over. Mrs. Abernathy, or the evil that wore her skin, had found a new vessel. And I was the only one who knew the truth. The following months were a twisted dance of paranoia and helplessness. I watched in silent horror as the new family settled into Mrs. Abernathy's old house, oblivious to the malevolent force that lurked within their youngest member. The girl, Sarah, I learned her name was, quickly became popular in the neighborhood. Her cherubic face and infectious laugh charmed everyone, but I saw through the facade. At night, I'd often catch glimpses of Sarah standing motionless in her bedroom window, staring directly at my house with those fathomless black eyes. Sometimes I'd hear whispers carried on the wind, promises of pain and suffering that made me wake up drenched in cold sweat. I tried to warn my parents, my teachers, anyone who would listen, but my pleas fell on deaf ears. "It's just your imagination running wild," they'd say, their voices laced with concern and a hint of exasperation. I was forced to see a psychiatrist, prescribed medication to help with my anxiety. But the pills did nothing to quell the growing dread that gnawed at my insides. As weeks turned into months, strange occurrences began to plague our neighborhood once again. This time, however, they were more sinister, more calculated. Mrs. Johnson's prize-winning roses withered overnight. Their petals turned to ash. The next day, she fell down her stairs, breaking both legs. Mr. Peterson's dog went berserk, mauling its owner before being shot by the police. And always, I'd see Sarah in the periphery, a small smile playing on her lips as chaos unfolded around her. The breaking point came on a crisp autumn evening, exactly 1 year after my first encounter with Mrs. Abernathy. I was home alone, my parents at a work function, when the power suddenly cut out. In the eerie silence that followed, I heard it, the slow, deliberate creak of our front door opening. Heart pounding, I crept downstairs, a baseball bat clutched in my trembling hands. As I rounded the corner into our living room, I saw her. Sarah stood in the center of the room, but she was no longer the picture of innocence. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, her hair wild and matted, and her eyes, God, her eyes, they swirled with an otherworldly darkness that threatened to pull me in. "Hello, Jack," she spoke, but it wasn't a child's voice that emerged. It was the raspy, guttural tone of Mrs. Abernathy. "Did you miss me?" I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. Sarah, or the thing possessing her, advanced slowly, savoring my fear. "You thought you could escape me? Foolish boy. I've waited centuries for a soul like yours. So pure, so full of delicious terror." As she spoke, her form began to shift and warp. Skin bubbled and stretched. Bones cracked and reformed. I watched in horror as Sarah's small frame twisted and grew, morphing into the nightmarish visage of Mrs. Abernathy that had haunted my dreams for the past year. "Your fear has made me stronger," the creature hissed, now towering over me. "And now I'll feast on your soul for eternity." In that moment, facing the manifestation of my deepest fears, something inside me snapped. Years of terror and helplessness crystallized into a white-hot rage. With a primal scream, I swung the bat with all my might, connecting squarely with the monster's head. There was a deafening shriek, not of pain, but of fury. The creature staggered back, its form flickering like a faulty hologram. I pressed my advantage, swinging again and again, each blow fueled by the pent-up anguish of the past year. As I landed the final blow, the thing that was once Sarah and Mrs. Abernathy let out an unearthly wail. Its body began to disintegrate, crumbling away like ash in the wind. In its place stood Sarah, the real Sarah, her eyes wide with confusion and terror. We stood there, two children forever changed by forces beyond our understanding, as sirens wailed in the distance. Sarah collapsed, sobbing, and I knew that she, like me, would carry the scars of this nightmare for the rest of her life. The authorities arrived, drawn by the commotion. They found two traumatized children and no evidence of the supernatural horror we had faced. Sarah's parents were bewildered, having no memory of the past year. As for me, I was left with the cold comfort of knowing the truth, that evil can wear many faces, and that the most insidious monsters are those that hide in plain sight. Years have passed, and I've tried to move on, to forget the terror that once consumed my life. But on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I can't help but wonder, is it truly over? Or is Mrs. Abernathy out there still, searching for her next victim, waiting to once again unleash her particular brand of hell on an unsuspecting soul? The gentle flutter in her belly should have been a source of joy for Sarah, a reminder of the new life growing within her. Instead, it only amplified the fear that had become her constant companion. At 7 months pregnant, Sarah's world should have been filled with excitement and anticipation. But for the past 3 weeks, her days and nights had been consumed by a growing terror that wore the face of a man she barely knew. It had started innocently enough. A chance encounter in the elevator of her apartment complex, a tall, lean man with piercing blue eyes and a disarming smile. He had introduced himself as Jack, a new tenant on the floor above hers. Sarah, always polite, had smiled back and exchanged pleasantries. She thought nothing of it at the time, just another face in the bustling city she called home. But that brief interaction had sparked something sinister in Jack's mind, a twisted fascination that would soon spiral into a nightmare for Sarah. The first sign came just days later. Sarah was returning from her prenatal checkup, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of her growing baby, when she noticed Jack lingering in the lobby. His eyes locked onto her, following her every movement as she made her way to the elevator. The intensity of his gaze sent a chill down her spine, but she brushed it off as paranoia. That night, a soft scratching at her door jolted Sarah from a fitful sleep. Heart pounding, she crept to the peephole, only to see Jack's distorted face pressed against it, his breath fogging the glass. Sarah stifled a scream, backing away as silently as she could. For hours, she huddled in her bedroom, listening to the persistent scratching, until it finally faded with the coming dawn. The next day, Sarah considered reporting the incident but hesitated. What if she was overreacting? What if no one believed her? The thought of confronting Jack or drawing attention to herself made her stomach churn. Instead, she decided to be more cautious, to avoid him at all costs. But Jack was not so easily deterred. He seemed to materialize wherever Sarah went, in the laundry room, by the mailboxes, in the parking garage. Always watching, always smiling that same unnerving smile. Sarah began to feel like a prisoner in her own home, afraid to leave for fear of encountering her unwanted shadow. One evening, as Sarah fumbled with her keys at her apartment door, a voice behind her made her blood run cold. "Need a hand with that, Sarah?" Jack's tone was friendly, but there was an undercurrent of something darker. Sarah's hand trembled as she finally managed to unlock the door. "No, thank you," she muttered, not daring to turn around. "You know," Jack continued, taking a step closer, "I've been thinking about you a lot lately, about us. Don't you feel it too?" The implication in his words sent a wave of nausea through Sarah. She stumbled into her apartment, slamming the door behind her and engaging every lock. Through the wood, she could hear Jack's low chuckle. "Sweet dreams, Sarah. I'll be seeing you soon." As Sarah sank to the floor, her back against the door, she felt a kick from her unborn child. In that moment, she knew she couldn't just hide and hope this would pass. For the sake of her baby, she had to find a way to end this nightmare. But how do you escape a shadow that refuses to leave? Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she leaned against the door, her mind reeling from Jack's chilling words. The baby kicked again, as if sensing its mother's distress. In that moment, Sarah knew she had to act. She couldn't let this twisted game continue any longer. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone, ready to call the police. But as her finger hovered over the emergency call button, doubt crept in. What if they didn't believe her? What if Jack somehow twisted the situation, made her look paranoid or unstable? The thought of being dismissed, or, worse, having her ability to care for her unborn child questioned, made her hesitate. Instead, Sarah opted for a different approach. She needed evidence, something concrete, to prove that Jack's behavior was more than just neighborly interest gone awry. With a deep breath, she opened her phone's camera and began to record. "My name is Sarah Walker," she whispered, her voice shaky but determined. "I'm 7 months pregnant, and I'm being stalked by a man named Jack who lives in my building. If anything happens to me or my baby, he's responsible." She proceeded to detail every encounter, every unsettling incident that had occurred over the past weeks. As she spoke, Sarah felt a strange mix of relief and terror. Putting words to her experiences made them feel more real, but also more horrifying. Just as she finished recording, a soft thud outside her door made her freeze. Sarah's heart pounded as she crept towards the peephole, dreading what she might see. Through the distorted lens, she saw Jack kneeling in front of her door, his face inches from the peephole. He was smiling, but it wasn't the disarming grin from their first meeting. This smile was predatory, hungry. "I know you're there, Sarah," Jack's muffled voice came through the door. "I can feel you. We're connected, you and I. You, me, and our little one." Sarah stumbled back, her hand flying to her swollen belly protectively. The possessive way Jack referred to her child sent waves of revulsion through her. She watched in horror as an envelope slid under her door. For what felt like hours, Sarah stared at the innocuous white envelope on her floor, afraid to touch it. Finally, mustering her courage, she picked it up with shaking hands. Inside was a single photograph. The image made her blood run cold. It was a picture of her, sleeping in her bed, taken from inside her bedroom. Jack had been in her apartment, invaded her most private space. The violation was complete. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but Sarah forced herself to think rationally. She couldn't stay here. It wasn't safe anymore. But where could she go? Jack seemed to be everywhere, always watching, always waiting. An idea struck her. Her friend Emma had a cabin in the woods, about 2 hours outside the city. It was isolated, peaceful, the perfect place to hide and gather her thoughts. Sarah quickly packed a bag, her hands shaking so badly she could barely zip it closed. As she prepared to leave, Sarah hesitated at the door. The thought of stepping out into the hallway, where Jack might be lurking, paralyzed her with fear. But the alternative, staying trapped in this apartment that no longer felt like home, was unthinkable. Taking a deep breath, Sarah opened the door. The hallway was mercifully empty, but she could feel eyes on her, watching from somewhere unseen. She hurried to the elevator, constantly looking over her shoulder. In the parking garage, Sarah's nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. As she approached her car, a figure stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. "Going somewhere, Sarah?" Jack's voice was silky smooth, but his eyes glittered with malice. Sarah's scream echoed through the cavernous space as she fumbled with her keys, desperate to escape. Sarah's scream echoed through the cavernous parking garage as she frantically fumbled with her keys. Jack's imposing figure loomed closer, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light that sent chills down her spine. Now, Sarah," Jack cooed, his voice dripping with false concern. "You shouldn't be running around in your condition. Why don't you let me drive you wherever you need to go?" Sarah's mind raced. She knew she couldn't outrun him, not in her current state. With a surge of desperate courage, she whirled around, car keys clutched between her fingers like makeshift brass knuckles. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice reverberating off the concrete walls. "I've called the police. They're on their way right now." Jack's smile never faltered, but something flickered in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps? Or was it excitement at the prospect of a challenge? "Oh, Sarah," he sighed, shaking his head like a disappointed parent. "Why do you insist on making this difficult? We're meant to be together. Can't you see that?" As he spoke, Jack took another step forward. Sarah's back hit her car, the cold metal a stark reminder of how trapped she was. In that moment of panic, she did the only thing she could think of. She pressed the panic button on her key fob. The sudden blare of the car alarm startled both of them. Jack flinched, momentarily disoriented by the noise. Sarah seized her chance. She yanked open the car door, threw herself inside, and locked it in one fluid motion. Her hand shook violently as she tried to start the car. Through the window, she could see Jack recovering, his face contorting with rage. He slammed his fists against the driver's side window, the glass vibrating dangerously with each impact. "You can't run from me, Sarah," he roared, his voice barely audible over the continuing alarm. "I'll always find you." The engine roared to life. Sarah threw the car into reverse, not caring if she hit anything or anyone in her desperation to escape. Jack was forced to jump back as she peeled out of the parking space. As she sped out of the garage and onto the street, Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. She had no plan beyond putting as much distance between herself and Jack as possible. The city lights blurred as she drove, her eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, terrified of seeing Jack's car in pursuit. It wasn't until she was on the highway, heading out of the city, that Sarah allowed herself to take a full breath. Her hands were cramped from gripping the steering wheel so tightly, and she could feel her unborn child moving restlessly within her, as if sensing its mother's distress. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, one hand leaving the wheel to rest on her swollen belly. "We're going to be okay." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew they might be a lie. Jack's final words echoed in her mind. "I'll always find you." The highway stretched out before her, dark and foreboding. Every pair of headlights in her rearview mirror made her heart race. Was it Jack? Had he somehow followed her? As the miles rolled by and the city faded into the distance, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Should she go to Emma's cabin as planned? But what if Jack knew about it? What if he was already there, waiting? The thought made her shudder. No, she needed to go somewhere unexpected, somewhere Jack couldn't anticipate. Sarah remembered a small motel she'd once stayed at on a road trip years ago. It was in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked while driving by. That would be her sanctuary, at least for tonight. Hours later, exhausted and emotionally drained, Sarah pulled into the motel's nearly empty parking lot. The neon vacancy sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie red glow over the cracked asphalt. As she cut the engine, the silence was deafening. Sarah checked in under a false name, paying cash for a single night. The room was small and musty, but it felt like paradise compared to the nightmare she'd left behind. As she locked and chained the door, Sarah finally allowed herself to break down. Sobs racked her body as she slid to the floor, the events of the day crashing over her like a tidal wave. When she finally calmed, Sarah dragged herself to the bed, too tired to even change clothes. As she drifted off into an uneasy sleep, her hand protectively cradled her unborn child. In the depths of the night, Sarah was jolted awake by a sound that made her blood run cold, a soft, persistent knocking at her door. As she lay there, paralyzed with fear, a familiar voice drifted through the thin wood. "Sarah, darling, open up. I told you I'd always find you." Sarah's scream died in her throat as the door handle began to turn. The soft padding of my dog's paws on the concrete was the only sound breaking the eerie silence of the dimly lit corridor. It was just past midnight, and the flickering fluorescent lights cast long, dancing shadows along the walls of my apartment complex. I had only moved in a week ago, and the unfamiliarity of my surroundings still sent shivers down my spine every time I ventured out for Buddy's late-night walk. As we rounded the corner to the stairwell, a door creaked open behind us. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Buddy's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl. "Oh, hello there," a cheerful voice called out. I turned to see a man in his mid-30s leaning against his doorframe. He had a friendly smile, but something about his eyes made my skin crawl. "You must be the new neighbor. I'm Jack." I forced a smile, trying to ignore the unease settling in my stomach. "Hi, I'm Sarah. Nice to meet you." Jack's eyes darted to Buddy, who was still growling softly. "And who's this little fella?" "This is Buddy," I replied, tugging gently on the leash. "He's usually friendlier. Sorry about that." Jack waved his hand dismissively. "No worries. Dogs have a sixth sense about people, you know." He chuckled, but the sound was hollow. "Say, Sarah, I was just about to have a nightcap. Care to join me? I've got a bottle of red that's begging to be opened." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I didn't want to seem rude. "Oh, thanks, but it's pretty late. Maybe another time?" Jack's smile faltered for a split second before widening again. Of course. No pressure. We're neighbors now, after all. Plenty of time to get to know each other." I nodded, mumbling a good night as I hurried down the stairs, Buddy practically pulling me along. As we exited the building, the cool night air hit my face, and I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Over the next few weeks, I saw Jack frequently. He always seemed to be in the hallway when I left for work or came home. His friendly demeanor never wavered, but each encounter left me feeling increasingly uneasy. One evening, as I fumbled with my keys at my door, I heard his voice behind me. "Need a hand with that, Sarah?" I jumped, nearly dropping my grocery bags. "Jack, you startled me." He was standing uncomfortably close, his eyes roaming over the bags in my arms. "Sorry about that. Let me help you with those." Before I could protest, he had taken the bags from my arms and was following me into my apartment. Panic rose in my throat as I realized I had just let this man into my home. "Oh, you really didn't have to," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can manage." Jack set the bags on the kitchen counter, his eyes scanning my apartment. "It's no trouble at all. That's what neighbors are for, right?" His gaze lingered on a framed photo of my family. "You live here alone?" The question sent a chill down my spine. "My boyfriend stays over sometimes," I lied, hoping it would deter any ideas he might have. Jack's smile tightened. "Is that so? I haven't seen anyone else coming or going." My heart raced as I realized he had been watching me. "He works nights," I said quickly. "Listen, Jack, thanks for the help, but I've got a lot to do tonight." He nodded, but made no move towards the door. Instead, he reached into one of the grocery bags and pulled out a bottle of wine. "Well, well, looks like you're planning a little celebration of your own. Mind if I join?" I opened my mouth to refuse, but Jack was already rummaging through my drawers for a corkscrew. The sound of the cork popping echoed in the silent apartment like a gunshot. "I really don't think," I started, but Jack cut me off. "Come on, Sarah. Don't be such a party pooper. One glass won't hurt." He poured 2 generous servings, holding one out to me with an expectant look. My mind raced, searching for a way out of this situation. As I reluctantly took the glass, a scratching sound came from my bedroom door. Buddy. I had put him in there when I went grocery shopping. Jack's eyes narrowed. "What's that noise?" "Oh, it's just Buddy," I said, relief washing over me. I should probably let him out. As I moved towards the bedroom, Jack's hand shot out, gripping my wrist tightly. "Let's not disturb the dog," he said, his voice low and threatening. "He might ruin our little party." I stared at him, fear paralyzing me. The friendly neighbor facade had crumbled, revealing something dark and terrifying underneath. As I looked into his eyes, I saw a glimmer of something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't the first time he had done this. The wine glass slipped from my hand, shattering on the floor. The sound seemed to snap Jack out of whatever trance he was in. He released my wrist, taking a step back. I should go," he muttered, his eyes darting around the room. "Thanks for the chat, Sarah." As he hurried out the door, I slumped against the wall, my whole body shaking. I knew this was far from over. The monster next door had shown his true colors, and I had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of my nightmare. The days following Jack's intrusion were filled with a suffocating dread. Every creak in the hallway, every shadow that passed beneath my door, sent my heart racing. I changed my locks, but it did little to ease the constant fear that had taken residence in my chest. One particularly dark evening, I returned home to find a small package outside my door. There was no return address, just my name scrawled in an unnervingly familiar handwriting. With trembling hands, I picked it up and hurried inside, double-checking every lock behind me. Buddy whined softly, sensing my distress, as I placed the package on the kitchen counter. For a long moment, I just stared at it, afraid of what I might find inside. Finally, mustering what little courage I had left, I carefully opened it. The contents made my blood run cold. Inside was a delicate silver charm bracelet, with a single charm dangling from it, a tiny dog, eerily similar to Buddy. Attached was a note that read, "A peace offering. Let's start over. Jay." I dropped the bracelet as if it had burned me, stumbling backward until I hit the wall. How had he known about my love for charm bracelets? I'd never mentioned it to him. The realization that he must have been in my apartment, rummaging through my belongings, hit me like a physical blow. That night, sleep eluded me. Every sound, every shadow, seemed to take on a sinister quality. I lay in bed, Buddy curled protectively at my feet, my eyes fixed on the bedroom door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore. I needed help. With shaking hands, I dialed the non-emergency police number, praying they would take me seriously. The officer who answered listened patiently as I recounted the events of the past weeks, from the unsettling first meeting to the disturbing gift. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the officer said, his voice tinged with what sounded like boredom. "But your neighbor hasn't actually done anything illegal. We can't act on a feeling." Desperation clawed at my throat. "But the gift? The bracelet? He must have broken in to know about that." "Unless you have proof of a break-in, there's nothing we can do. Maybe try talking to your landlord about the situation." The call ended, leaving me feeling more alone and vulnerable than ever. Days blurred together in a haze of paranoia and sleepless nights. I started taking different routes to work, varying my schedule, anything to throw off Jack's apparent surveillance. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One evening, as I hurried home from work, a figure stepped out of the shadows near the apartment entrance. My heart leapt into my throat as I recognized Jack's silhouette, "Sarah," he called out, his voice dripping with false cheer. "I've been hoping to catch you. We got off on the wrong foot the other night. Let me make it up to you." I clutched my pepper spray tightly, backing away. "Please, Jack, just leave me alone." His face darkened, all pretense of friendliness vanishing. "Now, that's not very neighborly, is it? After all I've done to welcome you?" "I know you've been in my apartment," I blurted out, immediately regretting my words as his eyes narrowed dangerously. A slow, unsettling smile spread across his face. "Oh, Sarah, if only you knew the half of it." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've been watching you for so long, even before you moved in. You're special, Sarah. I knew it from the moment I saw you touring the building." Ice flooded my veins as the implications of his words sank in. This wasn't a chance encounter. This wasn't just a creepy neighbor. This was something far more sinister. "You're crazy," I breathed, my voice barely audible. Jack's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp in the dim light. "Crazy? Oh no, Sarah, I'm just dedicated. You'll see. We're meant to be together." As he reached out to touch my face, I reacted on pure instinct. The pepper spray found its mark, and Jack's agonized scream echoed through the night. I ran, fumbling with my keys as I raced up the stairs to my apartment. Once inside, I collapsed against the door, my whole body shaking with sobs. Buddy pressed against me, whining softly, but even his presence couldn't calm the storm of terror raging inside me. I knew then that this was far from over. Jack's obsession ran deeper than I could have imagined, and I was trapped in a nightmare that was only beginning to unfold. As I sat there, the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway sent a fresh wave of panic through me. The footsteps paused outside my door, and a low, menacing voice drifted through the wood. "This isn't over, Sarah, not by a long shot." The footsteps retreated, but the threat lingered, hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. I realized with growing horror that my home, the one place that should have been my sanctuary, had become a prison, and my jailer was just on the other side of the wall, waiting, watching, planning his next move. The next few days passed in a blur of fear and sleepless nights. I barricaded my door, barely ate, and jumped at every sound. The hallway outside my apartment had become a no man's land, and I felt like a prisoner in my own home. On the third night, as I sat huddled on my couch with Buddy, a soft, scratching sound came from my front door. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the doorknob slowly turn. The chain lock held, but the door creaked open a few inches. Jack's voice drifted through the gap, sickeningly sweet. "Sarah, darling, why don't you open the door? We have so much to talk about." I remained frozen, silently praying he would give up and leave. "I know you're in there, Sarah." His tone shifted, growing darker. "I can smell your fear. It's intoxicating." The sound of something heavy hitting the door made me jump. Buddy started barking furiously, and I clamped my hand over his muzzle, terrified that Jack would hurt him. "You can't hide forever," Jack growled. "Sooner or later you'll have to come out, and when you do—" His laughter echoed through the apartment, sending chills down my spine. The banging continued for what felt like hours before finally subsiding. As silence settled over the apartment, I realized I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to escape. With shaking hands, I packed a small bag, my mind racing through possible safe havens. As I zipped up the bag, my eyes fell on the charm bracelet Jack had given me. A crazy idea formed in my mind. Maybe I could use his obsession against him. The next morning, I steeled myself and opened my door. The hallway was mercifully empty. I slipped the charm bracelet under Jack's door with a note. "Let's talk. Meet me at the park at sunset." As I waited in the park, my heart pounding, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a terrible mistake. But I had to know why he was doing this, had to find a way to end this nightmare. The sun was just dipping below the horizon when I saw Jack approaching, a bouquet of wilted roses in his hand and a manic gleam in his eyes. "Sarah," he breathed, his gaze roaming over me hungrily. "I knew you'd come around. We belong together." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his eyes. "Why me, Jack? Why are you doing this?" His smile was chilling. "Because you're perfect, Sarah, just like the others were. But you're special. You'll be the one who stays." A cold dread settled in my stomach. "Others? What others?" Jack's eyes glazed over, lost in some twisted memory. They were all so beautiful at first, but they all disappointed me in the end. Couldn't handle the depth of my love. He focused back on me, his grin widening. But you're different. You're stronger. You'll learn to love me back. As he spoke, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Peeking out from his jacket sleeve was another charm bracelet, identical to the one he'd given me. But this one was full of charms. Tiny dogs, cats, birds. With horrifying clarity, I realized what they represented. "The animals," I whispered, my voice shaking. "What did you do to them?" Jack's face contorted into a mask of rage. "They were tests," he spat. "I had to know if you were worthy, if you could handle the truth about me." He took a menacing step forward. "And now you know. Now we can truly be together." I backed away, my heart racing. "You're insane. I'm calling the police." As I turned to run, Jack lunged forward, grabbing my arm with bruising force. "You're not going anywhere," he snarled. "You're mine now." In that moment, survival instinct took over. I brought my knee up hard, catching him in the groin. As he doubled over in pain, I sprinted away, not daring to look back. I ran until my lungs burned, finally collapsing in a busy shopping center. With trembling hands, I called the police, gasping out my story between sobs. The next few hours were a blur of police statements and crime scene investigations. They found evidence in Jack's apartment that linked him to multiple missing persons cases and a string of animal mutilations across 3 states. The charm bracelet, with its grotesque trophies, was the final piece of evidence they needed. As I watched them lead Jack away in handcuffs, his eyes found mine. The look he gave me was one of pure, unadulterated hatred, promising that this wasn't over. Even as they pushed him into the police car, his voice carried to me on the night air. "I'll find you, Sarah. No matter where you go, no matter how far you run, we're meant to be together forever." Those words haunt me to this day. I've moved across the country, changed my name, but I can never shake the feeling that he's out there, watching, waiting. Every new neighbor, every friendly stranger could be him in disguise. The locks on my doors are triple bolted now, and I sleep with a weapon nearby. But it's the psychological scars that cut the deepest. The trust I once had in people has been shattered, replaced by constant paranoia. As I sit here, writing this warning to others, I can't help but glance nervously at my window. Was that a shadow moving outside? Is that scratching sound just the wind, or something more sinister? In the end, the most terrifying realization is this: the monsters we fear aren't hiding under our beds or in our closets. They're living next door, wearing friendly smiles and offering to help with our groceries. And once they set their sights on you, nowhere is truly safe. So to anyone reading this, I beg you, be careful who you trust. The charming neighbor with the winning smile might be hiding the darkest of secrets, and by the time you discover the truth, it might already be too late.